Vietnamisation. It's a very common topic. It's a very simple topic. Follow a very simple pattern here to get everything you need. Essentially, all you need to remember is there's three things. All right. We can talk about Vietnamisation, talk about the causes of it, talk about what it was, and talk about the results of it. Okay? Easy. Right. Causes. And again, there are three of them. The first cause, first thing you have to remember, one of the reasons for Vietnamisation was that in 1960, let me get this straight, 69, there was a new US president, and his name was Richard Nixon. He replaced Lyndon B. Johnson, who chose not to stand for re-election. And Richard Nixon, when he campaigned to become president, promised to bring the troops back home. Both candidates did, but Nixon did as well, so he had to deliver on that when he became president. The election was in November, December 1968, but he was sworn in 1969. That's why you might see two different dates. Okay, so he said he'd bring the troops home, and the reason for that is because of all the opposition in the US. The war was very, very, very unpopular. The high casualty rates that the Americans were suffering from, and the increasing cost of fighting this long, long war and funding all these troops. There's 500,000 men in 1968, and paying for that was massively expensive and money that could be spent on many other things within the US itself. And 1968, the Tet Offensive. You know, the US thought, the American people thought they were winning the war. Suddenly the Tet Offensive happened, and it was portrayed as a defeat by the US media, and that increased opposition to the war. So then Nixon said, look, I'll get us out. So, problem was, the second thing, is Nixon said, I'll bring our boys back home, but he can't just go, right, I'm president now, January 69, come on boys, let's go, off you come. He couldn't do that because he would have seemed to have lost the war. And no US president had ever lost a war up to that point. And he said he didn't want to be the first. So he needed to find a solution where he could get the soldiers out and still maintain American honor. And that solution was Vietnamisation. And he figured that what he would do is increase the number of South Vietnamese troops, and they would take over the protection or the defense of South Vietnam from the Americans. So one, new president with his promise. Two, couldn't just withdraw them. And three, getting the South Vietnamese to protect themselves. Okay? So then the events, again, three events. Like I previously mentioned, the ARVN were going to be increased in size to take the place of the US troops. In 1968, there were 500,000 men in the ARVN. By 1972, I believe it was 1 million South Vietnamese men, or South Vietnamese people in uniform protecting the country. And as the US troops left, what they would do is they would leave their equipment for the ARVN. And that's the second point. So the first one, ARVN increased in size. Second one, the US would supply the ARVN with weapons, ammunition, vehicles, artillery, and as they left, they would leave their equipment for the ARVN to use. Second feature of Vietnamisation. Third one was the actual withdrawal of US troops. So remember at its peak, there were 500,000 US troops in Vietnam in 1968. Now by April 1970, Nixon said, I'm going to withdraw 150,000 US troops, and I'm going to bring them back home to the US, to the States. By the end of 1971, 400,000 had been withdrawn, which left a little bit over 100,000 in Vietnam still. So the numbers are decreasing hugely. And he promised that everyone would leave, all the Americans would leave by 1972. All right. Critics said it wasn't fast enough, but he was withdrawing the troops. So one, ARVN increased. Two, US would fund them. Three, US troops would leave. That's what Vietnamisation was. So then you do the consequences. And I think it's important that we look at the consequences of the Vietnamisation in the US. Number one, very popular amongst the American people who wanted to end the war. Saying that, wasn't very popular amongst American military commanders who thought they could have won the war if they'd stuck it out. So that's it in the US. Secondly, in South Vietnam. Now, Diem had obviously been replaced, and the guy in charge, who I always pronounce his name wrong, President Thieu, Thieu, he was supposed to be a democratic leader, and the Americans were supposed to be protecting democracy in South Vietnam. But in actual fact, he became much more of a dictator, much more oppressive. He bribed voters in elections, he imprisoned his opponents, democracy was essentially dead in South Vietnam. And then the third effect of Vietnamisation is its effect on the US Army. This is the biggest one, the juiciest one. Essentially, once the Americans realised, or the troops realised that they were going to be withdrawn, their morale just went and plummeted, their morale, how enthusiastic they were about the war. Okay? And they didn't want to be the last person to die in Vietnam for a lost war, because they knew they were leaving. That links back very nicely to John Kerry's evidence in the Fulbright hearings, where he said, I think I'll get this right, how do you ask a man to be the last man to die? How do you ask the last man to be a man to die in a war? And how do you ask the last man to die in a war that's wrong or unjust, okay, or a mistake? And essentially, he's saying, look, these guys just don't want to fight. This war's wrong. So as a result of this drop in morale, what happened was there was an increase in soldiers wanting to avoid combat. They didn't want to go out. It wasn't search and destroy anymore. It was search and avoid. And in fact, some officers, though, still wanted to go out on search and destroy missions and fight the war because it's very important for their careers. Fortunately, their troops didn't want to do that because they could die and they didn't want to be the last man to die. So you got this thing called fragging, which is pretty nasty. It comes from the word fragmentation grenade, which is a grenade, high explosive grenade that fragments and shatters out. And it was a way of killing unpopular officers. American troops would frag him to stop him from putting their lives in danger. I think there's an official report that says between 1969 and 1971 there were 730 fragging incidents. Those are official figures. 83 American officers murdered by their own troops in fragging incidents. And that doesn't include those attacked with knives and rifles and other things. So no idea how many of those occurred. So fragging and lower morale. Secondly, another aspect of Vietnamisation, another consequence for the US troops in Vietnam, was increasing number of desertion rates and soldiers going absent without leave, AWOL. They just left. And thirdly, an increasing dependence on alcohol and drugs became apparent. Soldiers turned to marijuana, heroin, and alcohol as a way of kind of dealing with the stress and the horror of the war they were fighting. I think one official statistic, one reporter said he claimed that 1 in 10 American troops were addicted to heroin, which is pretty astonishing. And there was famous photographs of American soldiers smoking pot out of rifle barrels and stuff and things like that. So, causes, 3 of them. Events, 3 of them. Results, in the US, in South Vietnam, and for the US military. All right, I hope that makes sense.